Welcome to CMO Convo Video. In this series, we highlight some of the biggest takeaways from the CMO Convo podcast, the show where we examine marketing leadership with some of the best and brightest CMOs in the biz. This is part one of our Storymasters series, featuring Gaston Tourn, CMO of Curio, where we examine the importance of storytelling and marketing and why defamiliarization is essential for engaging audiences. Welcome back to CMO Diaries. It's been away for a while, but we're here with Storymasters, and I'm here with Gaston Tourn, a man who needs very little introduction to for the regular listeners of CMO Convo. But for this new show, Gaston, maybe you could tell us a little bit about who you are and why we're talking about the subject, why it's so important.
Yes, so thanks so much, Will, for having me again at the CMO Convo. Well, this time it's Storymasters, but still we're going to be discussing one of my favorite topics, which is storytelling. Who am I? I think I always wanted to become a fiction writer, but life took me to marketing, which I think is not far away from writing and creativity. And I think a lot of those skills that I want to apply to fiction writing, and I still apply because on the side I'm a writer, I can also definitely use for marketing. I'm a CMO. I work at Appear Here. Appear Here is the world's largest marketplace for retail spaces. Before Appear Here, I was working at Google in different marketing roles across different markets, started in Argentina, where I'm from. I also work in Brazil, the US, and then the UK. And I was also CMO at Badoo Group, which now is called Bumble Group. It's a group of dating apps, and also at Emma, a literacy company. So a marketeer, a storyteller, a bit of both.
Awesome. So the perfect person to be doing this series with, for sure. So part of this series, we're going to be taking a look at some of the traditional or historic literary techniques that people who study literature get pounded over the head over constantly over the ways to tell stories using those techniques. But it's not really something that comes up a lot in marketing circles. Why are we talking about Aristotle? Why are we talking about Coleridge on the show? Why is it important to marketing?
Yes, I think, first of all, this is something that we started discussing in previous podcasts. Like, I think I am a nerd and I love studying literary theory, and I love to see how some principles that, have been true about storytelling for like thousands of years are still true to like the marketing that we do nowadays. I think sometimes we get lost with like new metrics or like new methods of like, performance marketing and like, what's the kind of like new app technology platform. But in the end, marketing is all about influencing someone to do something. If I have to be very, very just concise and have to explain my grandparents who have no clue what is tech and like what is marketing, I have to tell them, what do you do for a living? I am persuading, I'm influencing people to do something. But in order to influence people, I think one thing that definitely humanity has explored for a long time is that human brains are not purely rational. Human brains definitely connect much more with stories than facts and data. And I think that's a good thing. Of course, sometimes it's a bad thing because like we make decisions that are not purely rational, but it's the way that the human brain has worked. There's always an emotional side to the human brain. And I think stories and storytelling is the best way to connect with that side of the human brain. And that's why it's so relevant for marketeers, because if you want to influence or persuade something to someone, I think you need to understand how the emotional side of that human brain works. And I think storytelling is the best way to get into it.
And the principles of storytelling, like we're going to be talking about some very, very old concepts dating back to ancient Greek times. We're going to talk about stuff from Aristotle. We're going to be talking about more recent stuff. Well, more recent relatively. We're going to be talking about stuff from like 19th century authors and 18th century authors. But those principles of storytelling that these people came up with, these literary critics came up with, they're still relevant in how we tell stories today in fiction and film. Like the mediums might have changed, but how we tell stories hasn't changed too much. And it's the same with marketing. Like there's all these new technologies might come out, all these new ways of telling stories might come out, but the actual principles, the building blocks of what makes a great story are going to stay the same.
Yes, definitely. I think particularly there are like some principles that have been like very true for thousands of years. If you read like books like The Poetics from Aristotle, that are so relevant to the type of stories that we tell nowadays, that I think like they definitely tell you like, yes, maybe of course in different cultural contexts, stories are going to take different shapes. but there are some structures that are still relevant to any type of story. And I think there is so much that we can learn, not just marketeers, but actually anyone in business, because I think storytelling is a critical skill, not just in marketing. If you're going to do fundraising, if you're going to explain to the board of investors, if you actually want to get a promotion, like in all those different situations, storytelling is going to be super useful. And I think, as you said, sometimes we just rely on business sources or like business books to understand how to persuade or influence. But I feel like the ones that have done this really well for a long time is writers and storytellers. We pay to read some of those stories. Like we pay to, for example, watch a Netflix series, or we pay to read a novel. Would we do the same with an advert? I think that that's my quality bar. Like I want people to pay to see the adverts that we produce, because that would tell me we're doing something so persuasive that actually people want to hear about it. And I think like that's the quality bar that we need to have. And I think literary critics and in general, people who have studied the art of storytelling can give us a lot of insights on how to make our stories so compelling that people cannot resist watching or reading them.
And it's the marketing and brands and advertisements that tell really effective stories that stand the test of time. It's the ones that people go back to and rewatch as great examples. We're going to dig into some of those examples as part of this show. And we're going to talk about the literary theories that underpin sort of like the great nature of the stories that they're telling. But we're not just going to throw around theories. We are going to talk about how to practically apply it, how you're applying these concepts in your own work, and how other CMOs can do the same.
Yes, definitely. I think we're not going to be too nerdy. Don't worry. We're going to be just like using some concepts that I think hopefully it's going to give you like enough language or like some concepts that you can then apply to your own marketing to make your stories much more interesting. And the concepts that I apply on my everyday work, I think like I definitely studied a lot of literary theory. I never thought that I was going to end up in marketing. But then actually when I have been working marketing now for like a few years, I find that like those concepts really help to elevate whatever creative I am producing. So definitely we're going to be talking about some literary theory, but then applying that directly to how you can make your marketing creatives much more compelling and much more interesting.
So the two main topics we're going to talk about on this episode, they're sort of two main fundamentals behind storytelling. Do you want to introduce the two concepts for us, Gaston?
Yes, one has a very difficult name. It actually comes from like the Russian formalists, which was a very important literary theory school in the early 20th century. It's called ostranenie, which sounds really weird, but actually what it means is estrangement or like defamiliarization. It's basically making the familiar unfamiliar or the unfamiliar familiar. We're going to be discussing it a bit more, so I'm not going to disclose too much, but sounds difficult, but it's actually not that difficult. The second concept, a fundamental of any good story, which is suspension of disbelief. You need to believe the unreal to be real in order to actually persuade you in the story. If like, something happens in the story and then you're like, oh, that's going to be like actually not true, or like that's not really what could happen, people switch off and like people don't really believe in the story. So there needs to be a suspension of disbelief. You need to actually get so immersed into that world that you believe everything that is going on. I think sometimes marketing stories don't achieve that for different reasons. So we're going to be discussing as well, like what you need to do in order to really create that suspension of disbelief. So ostranenie sounds difficult, but trust me, it's not going to be that complex. And the second one, suspension of disbelief.
Let's start with the most complex one then, shall we? Let's start with ostranenie. Or defamiliarization, which I'm probably going to use because it's a bit easier to say as part of our discussion. But yeah, as you said, like started off with Victor Shklovsky in Artist's Device in his essay, which was published in 1917. And it's basically how to distinguish poetic or storytelling language from practical language at its essence, isn't it? It's like, how do you set apart a story from an informational guide? And it's how you present those ideas in a new way to the audience, in a way that they think about things differently, I suppose is a good way of putting it.
Exactly. I think what ostranenie does is like it really captures people's attention. And then that's what marketing tries to do as well, right? I think our everyday life sometimes can be quite monotonous and repetitive. And I think what this literary resource or technique does is just like makes the familiar unfamiliar. It kind of like in a way presents a new way of looking at things that are like very familiar, or vice versa, something that is like incredibly unfamiliar, it makes it look like super familiar, and then you're like, oh god, what is this all about? Like, it's kind of like actually making something that would look like completely unreal possible, like potentially actually something that you could encounter in your everyday life. And I think it's, I mean, like probably one of the reasons is like, to be honest, I think everyday life can be quite monotonous and quite boring. And I think like in order to spice it up, you do need to look at things like in an unfamiliar way. I think one of my favorite examples, like I'm from Latin America, so of course I love magical realism. Magical realism is one of the most interesting, of course I'm biased, I'm from Latin America, but one of the most interesting literary kind of schools, I think, in the 20th century. What it tries to do is just like really, in a way, it's not science fiction at all. It's just like bringing some magical elements to reality. It's just like telling a story that it could be real, but with some magical elements that makes it a bit like distorted, and you're not really sure what's going on. And I think like one example from, for example, like one of the most important books of that literary school is 100 Years of Solitude from Garcia Marquez. An amazing novel that I recommend every marketeer to read. It's like, I think like probably one of the best examples of how to tell a really, really compelling story. One thing that Garcia Marquez does is uses familiar elements in a very unfamiliar way. So for example, in this story, at some point, it starts to rain, but it doesn't stop raining for 5 years. So there's a rain that actually lasts 5 years. And it's really weird because like, imagine like if you actually live in a world where like rain doesn't stop for 5 years, but at the same time, it's not completely impossible. So it makes something that is very familiar, like rain, affect everyday life in a really, really strange way. So there's so many other examples. I think like another amazing, talking about rain, like one movie I love that uses a very similar resource is Magnolia. Again, starts to rain, but it doesn't rain water, it actually starts raining frogs. So you have a world where like, rather than having rain that comes out like that is actually just water, what we're used to, suddenly you have frogs, like for example, like breaking houses or cars or like different things, because it's very unfamiliar for what we're used to. So that's what ostranenie is in a nutshell. It's just making something that is quite common, quite usual, look unfamiliar, because that captures people's attention. That actually makes people realize like, wow, the world I live in is not that common. It's actually quite uncommon. And I think it brings back that magic to everyday life.
And it's not just strangeness or differences for the sake of differences, particularly with magical realism, like the alterations they make to reality are about holding up a mirror to reality to make you think about your current reality differently. I think a great example from the world of advertising marketing is probably car adverts. Like cars themselves are machines, they're mechanical, they're made of metal, they've got all these stuff inside of it. But when you see cars advertised on television, they don't talk about like, this is where all the screws are, this is where you'll sit. They talk about the feeling that comes with being in the car. They talk about the destinations you can go to. They talk about like the way that this car will transform your world in a certain way. It's not about just the practicalities of the object. It's about the potential and the new way of looking at the world provided by that by the car.
Completely. Yes, I think how we apply ostranenie to marketing story. I think marketing stories cannot just illustrate what the product does. Like they need to elevate the product experience. And I think that's exactly what you're saying about car adverts. I think any marketing advert that just illustrates, shows in very practical terms what a product does, is going to have some effectiveness, but at the same time, it's not going to build the brand. It's not going to tell a compelling story about the brand. I think because, again, going back to this principle about ostranenie and like how defamiliarization really gets people attention, if you're just telling something that is quite practical, like just shows the product and how it works, it's going to be quite dull. Like people are going to get bored. But if you defamiliarize it, if you actually elevate it a bit and you show that experience, it captures people's imagination. And I think it's going to be just a much stronger emotional connection to that product.
So what are some actual real world examples of this in practice? I mentioned car adverts, but let's talk about like some specific campaigns or brands that are doing this really well.
One of my favorite ones is from Google Analytics, the product that I'm sure like a lot of marketers use on their everyday lives, and they're probably a bit bored of using just Google Analytics and like all the metrics and bounce rates and conversion rates. And I choose this example because I say like, ostranenie is about defamiliarizing the everyday life. And I think for marketeers, like Google Analytics is our everyday life. We're using it all the time. It's so common. But what this campaign does, it's called Google Analytics in real life. And it was one of the first campaigns from Google Analytics. It defamiliarizes some of the metrics and puts them in real life. So for example, a metric like bounce rate. What would bounce rate mean if you actually are in a shop? So it actually uses like some almost like parallels of like what would happen if some of those metrics actually happen in a real store. And I think it makes it actually so visible that a lot of our online experiences are just like really bad. Like for example, the checkout. When you're trying to like check out on a website and it asks you 10,000 like different pieces of information. And then when you actually click on like buy, it asks you like a new piece of information. And sorry, now the connection is not working. And all those things that, we have to go through when we buy something online brings all those elements to a real interaction in a cashier in a supermarket. And it makes it really funny, but at the same time, it really brings to light how bad our online checkout experiences are. So I think like that's one of my favorite examples, just because I think sometimes Google Analytics can be quite like dry as a product. But when you see this campaign, you start to understand how some of those metrics, they have a massive impact on the customer experience. And I think they do that, like that campaign, just by defamiliarizing, using some of those online metrics in a real interaction, in a shop. And I think like by doing that, really captures your attention and really makes you aware of like what's maybe going wrong on your online customer experience.
Humor is probably a really good way of thinking about this in terms of easy ways that you can play. I know being funny is quite a difficult thing, but if you think about things in terms of parody or satire, they're probably a really great way of thinking about how to apply defamiliarization in a practical way.
Completely. Yes, I think in general, most stories don't have just a literary kind of like, or a literal way of telling a story. I think like usually there is some level of like irony or some level of metaphor that I think makes the story a bit more interesting. I think if we're literal, usually we're going to be on the practical level. And I think people kind of like, in a way, switch off, because it's almost like, well, you're just telling me like the facts, but you're not involving me in the story. I think one of the most beautiful like parts of like the poetics from Aristotle, what he says is like, whenever it comes to an argument, let's say you have like, a premise and another premise and then a conclusion. If you tell people directly the conclusion and you let them infer the premises, they're going to be much more interested in your conclusion, and they're going to be much more interested in whatever you have to say, because they're going to feel smart. They're going to be like, oh, you're saying that because I'm inferring that that's your premise. But if you go the logical way, if you just go like premise A, premise B, then conclusion, it's a bit boring, because it's almost like you're being a bit patronizing. You're just being like, a very kind of like old school teacher that's like just like giving all the different facts before I give you the conclusion, which is probably what more like product-led just acts do. It's like, I give you all the premises, then you should buy this. But if you start the other way around, if you actually start with the conclusion, if you elevate that story, if you have not a literal kind of like tone, but a bit more metaphoric, or you use some level of irony, I think it just makes people much more compelled. And also it makes them feel smart, because I think that's what irony does. It's like, we are being complicit about something that only you and I know. And that makes me feel closer to you, but it also makes me feel smart, because I kind of infer what you were trying to say.
I think a great example of that, it's one of my favorite adverts of all time, is the Guinness surfer advert, where it's all about this surfer in Hawaii waiting for his entire life for the perfect wave to come along. And he hits the wave, and there's all these dramatic drums going, pounding, the waves are crashing. And at the end, it just cuts to a pint of Guinness, and good things come to those who wait. At no point does it say anything as simple as drink Guinness. It's almost as good as catching the best wave of your entire life, that you'll achieve the same sense of victory. But it allows the viewer to draw its own connections between the story that's going on, the metaphor that's being told through the Guinness surfer ad. And it allows people who like Guinness, people who know that you have to wait for the pint to settle and stuff like that, to recognize those elements, to recognize that anticipation on their own speed. And that builds a bit more of a emotional connection between you and the advert and the product itself. So yeah, if you haven't seen the advert, check it out. Just Google Guinness surfer ad. It's one of my favorites of all time.
Nice. I haven't watched it, so I'm very, very curious to see. Yeah.
Oh, it's fantastic. It's one of the reasons I got into marketing to begin with, because I wanted to be creating stuff like that. But again, it tells a really, really effective story that is unfamiliar. Like, I doubt there's a lot of crossover between Hawaiian surfers and Guinness drinkers, particularly in the UK, where the advert was shown first. But you're able to draw this connection between these two unfamiliar scenarios in a way that makes sense at the same time. And I think that's a really, really good application of ostranenie or defamiliarization in a marketing space. But let's talk about how you're applying these principles. Let's talk about some of the examples that you're doing.
Yes, I think one campaign that we already discussed in one of our previous podcasts is Save the Street. This is a campaign that I led during the pandemic, especially in the first lockdown. So for those of you who don't know Appear Here, what we do is like we connect mostly independent brands and independent stores with spaces to make their ideas happen. And of course, during the pandemic, what we saw is that a lot of these independent brands and independent stores were like really, really struggling. Big retailers got a lot of help from government, but independent retailers didn't. And actually, it was quite interesting because like some of those big retailers even returned the money back to the government because they were like, we don't need this like support. Whereas independent retailers were the ones like who needed it the most. And I think like they are like definitely like, you know, some of the most important elements that build a community, a local community. So what happened during that time is like we said, like, look, we are supporting this community. We need to really bring their demands back to the government. And I think we really need to act as a voice of independent retailers. So we started working on this campaign called Save the Street. I had a petition to the government, and we got actually a lot of like support out of it. I think particularly when it comes to business rates, I think like there was a lot of support from government. The Minister of Small Business in the UK mentioned the Save the Street campaign when he announced like new measures for independent retailers. So it was a very successful way of like supporting independent retailers to survive during the pandemic. But when it comes to actually like the campaign creatives, we didn't go fully like political manifesto. We actually tried to think about how we can defamiliarize some of these communications and how we can actually make them much more interesting and compelling for someone who perhaps doesn't care about independent stores or who doesn't care about high streets as much as we do. So we worked with a poet called Charlie Cox to create a poem for our high streets. And it was a really good way of defamiliarizing how we interact with high streets and what kind of meaning high streets have for people all across the country. So I think you can watch it online. If you go to Save the Street poem on YouTube, you can see it. But I feel like some favorite lines from that poem talks about, for example, like the baristas that know your name before you say hello, which I think is a quite beautiful way of saying like how we build community and how we build relationships in those high streets. And for a lot of people actually that we spoke to, the high street is the only social interaction they have. And when they were closed, they really, really struggle with mental health because of the lack of interactions in the high street. There is actually a really good research from Public Health England that shows the impact on mental health related to like poor high streets. Another favorite line talks about the high streets and the low ties. And it talks about basically how there's a relationship between the high streets kind of like creating community, but at the same time, when they're like low and they're like removed from everyday life is the same as when like basically the sea kind of like shows all the garbage in a way that is like in the sea. So there were like some beautiful moments in that poem that I think they were not typical for a political campaign, but in the end, I think what they did, like those lines and those poems, I think was like defamiliarizing something and bringing new attention to why high streets are so important to build community.
Sure, and poetry in essence is an excellent form of defamiliarization. It requires you to think about things in different ways. I mean, great quote from Aristotle: "Poetic language must be strange and wonderful." And I think that's a perfect way of summing up why defamiliarization is so important. Because it highlights what is wonderful about the everyday. Like the high street is a great example of that. I think a lot of people took it for granted prior to the pandemic, and now people are ready to return to the high street. They're ready to start enjoying like these independent retailers that they used to enjoy. So there has to be some kind of campaign to keep them around, kind of thing, and that's what the Save the Street campaign was all about. So ostranenie, I keep struggling with this. I know. Ostranenie. Is there anything else that we want to talk about in terms of how to apply it in a marketing concept before we move on to willing suspension of disbelief?
I think, particularly in the times we're living, reality looks a bit unfamiliar. So sometimes it's actually not really going into the unfamiliar territory, but it's more making the unfamiliar familiar as well. So think about, in the end, it's like how we can capture people's attention. And I think this is a really interesting resource that you can use. I think one of my favorite campaigns actually from Bumble during lockdown, what they did is like they pick up just like very common phrases that we use in dating, but they kind of like, in a way, apply them to a context that is very unfamiliar, which is like lockdown, right? So a very common phrase that we would use in dating is like your house or mine. But rather than using your house or mine, because people couldn't go to each other's houses, they did a billboard that was like your park or mine. Dating got weird, Bumble. And like that was another beautiful example of using ostranenie, right? In an unfamiliar world, which is I think like what we're living at the moment, sometimes actually making the unfamiliar familiar is perhaps a really, really good resource as well. So ostranenie, I think, is like such a useful principle. I use it all the time I review creatives, but I think it doesn't just mean making the familiar unfamiliar. Sometimes in a really, really strange world that I think we're all living at the moment, maybe making the unfamiliar familiar is also a really interesting creative resource to use.
Excellent. Want to know more on what it takes to be the ultimate marketing leader? Make sure you like and subscribe to this channel for more insights straight from the biggest marketing minds around. Visit CMOalliance.com for even more resources to take your CMO career path to the next level.